Tonight, we drift down to a time when Rome was still figuring out how to walk without tripping over its own sandals, and Carthage. Well, Carthage was already bathing in purple dye and running trade routes longer than your favorite drama series. The Mediterranean is calm tonight, just a soft breeze rippling across its surface, but don't let that fool you. Underneath that glassy sea power is shifting tensions are brewing, and you, dear traveller, are about to stumble into the start of one of history's most personal feuds. You'll cross dusty hills, clank through cobbled ports, and possibly get run over by a very confused war elephant. You probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And feel free to post your location and local time in the comments. Always fun to see who's listening from where. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin in Rome, still more of a promising teenager than an empire. It's the 3rd century BCE, and Rome has just barely muscled its way into control of the Italian peninsula through alliances, wars, and the occasional act of very polite bullying. Carthage, by contrast, is old money, Phoenician in origin, wealthy from trade and draped in maritime swagger. If Rome's wealth is tied to soil and spears, Carthage's is tied to salt, silver, and sails. They've got harbours like mazes and shipyards that never sleep. You can practically smell the pitch and hear the echo of hammer strikes shaping the hulls of their mighty quinqueremes. At first, the two civilizations avoid direct confrontation. Rome is landlocked in its mindset, while Carthage sails circles around the Mediterranean like it's their personal pool. But then something tempting appears between them, like a sweet roll set on the table of a fasting monk, the island of Sicily. Just off the toe of Italy, Sicily is rich, fertile, and unfortunately full of quarrelsome Greek city-states, rogue mercenaries, and frustrated neighbors. It's also smack between Carthaginian and Roman zones of influence, which is never a recipe for calm negotiations. A minor dispute in the Sicilian town of Messana becomes the spark. Local mercenaries, the Mamertines, ask both Rome and Carthage for help. Carthage arrives first and sets up shop, but the Mamertines then invite Rome as well, because why settle for one overbearing guest when you can have two? Rome debates the risk of meddling outside the mainland, but eventually decides to step in. After all, Sicily is practically in arm's reach, and the Senate smells opportunity, also hubris, but mostly opportunity. So you cross into Sicily with the Roman legion's sandals grinding over volcanic soil shields, baking under the island sun. The Carthaginians stare back with the weary patience of a trading empire used to fending off pirates, not full-scale land armies. At first, skirmishes are awkward, almost polite, like two rival chefs competing over a shared kitchen space. But soon it escalates into the First Punic War, 23 years of very impolite brawling that spreads across Sicily, the seas, and even the coastlines of North Africa. Here's your first mainstream fact: this war becomes the longest continuous conflict in ancient history up to that point. It's not a sprint, it's a long, bitter march, full of sieges, shipwrecks, and budget overruns. Rome has no navy to speak of, but Carthage does. And yet Rome isn't about to let that stop them. Historians still argue whether Rome entered the war with a clear plan for Mediterranean domination, or just stumbled into it like a goat through a market stall. Either way, once committed, Rome doesn't let go. It starts building ships, dozens, then hundreds. They capture a Carthaginian quinquereme and reverse engineer it like college students taking apart a motorcycle they don't know how to reassemble. They even add a boarding device called the corvus, a big swinging plank with a spike that turns sea battles into floating land fights. Ingenious, also extremely top-heavy. Many Roman ships capsize in rough waters, but that's a lesson for later. Still, here's your quirky tidbit. Rome allegedly practiced naval maneuvers by having soldiers march on land to simulate ship formations. Yes, they rode on dry earth. It was like a massive state-funded improv class in maritime warfare, and surprisingly it worked. Back in Sicily, battles rage, Agrigentum falls, Mount Etna rumbles in the distance. You can feel the tension in the air like the crackle before a storm. Neither side wants to back down, but Carthage isn't used to fighting on land this long, and Rome isn't used to fighting at sea at all. That balance, land versus sea elephants versus discipline, coin versus stubbornness, will come to define everything that follows. So now you stand in the middle of a slow-burning fuse lit by mercenaries and fanned by ambition. The First Punic War isn't personal yet, not truly. But wait until names like Hamilcar and Hannibal enter the chat. That's when this cold chess match turns into a family feud with siege towers. You watch the sun set over the Sicilian hills, both Roman and Carthaginian banners fluttering in awkward standoff. There's something deeply tired in the eyes of the soldiers around you. They don't yet know this war will last for more than 2 decades, but you do, and it's only just begun. You wake the next morning to the creak of ropes and the squawk of gulls circling above a makeshift Roman dockyard. The First Punic War is underway, and Rome is about to do something wildly uncharacteristic, become a naval power overnight. You hear the crack of timber, the clang of iron, and the shouting of carpenters who've probably never been to sea but are now officially shipwrights. Rome, a city that once looked at the ocean like a suspicious puddle, now commissions fleets as though Neptune himself handed them a blueprint. The turning point isn't just ambition, it's desperation. Carthage dominates the sea. Their ships are faster, their sailors more experienced, and their admirals practically sleep in hammocks. Rome, meanwhile, builds ships by copying a single Carthaginian vessel that wrecked on the Italian coast. This captured quinquereme becomes the mold for an entire navy. Think of it as the world's most aggressive case of intellectual property theft. You're assigned to one of the early Roman ships. It smells of fresh pine and wet pitch, the hull still sticky where the paint hasn't dried. The innovation that makes this fleet work is the corvus, a boarding bridge that drops like a mechanical tongue onto enemy ships, locking them in place for brutal hand-to-hand combat. Sea battles in Rome's mind should resemble land battles, with stabbing and yelling and the comforting chaos of close-range violence. And for a while it works. The corvus turns naval combat into something Roman soldiers understand. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Rome's first major naval victory at the Battle of Mylae in 260 BCE is a stunner. Under Consul Gaius Duilius, the Roman fleet uses the corvus to devastating effect, capturing or sinking dozens of Carthaginian ships. It's such a shock that Duilius is honored with a victory parade and a commemorative column which historians say may be the earliest Roman monument built for a naval battle. But success is wobbly. Rome builds fast but not always well. Their ships are bulky, and storms don't care about patriotism. In 255 BCE, a fleet returning from Africa is caught in a storm and wrecked. Hundreds of ships lost, tens of thousands of men drowned. It's one of the greatest maritime disasters in ancient history. Rome rebuilds. Another fleet wrecked again, rebuilds again. The pattern becomes a running theme. Win a battle, lose a fleet, repeat. At one point, Roman citizens are rumored to have grown tired of contributing to the war chest, and senators have to find increasingly creative ways to raise funds without causing riots. Meanwhile, in Sicily, the war grinds on like a slow plague. You walk through the rubble of cities that have changed hands 3 or 4 times. Children play with broken javelins. Crops rot in fields no one dares to harvest. Carthaginian commanders dig in behind high walls, refusing pitched battles, while Roman consuls argue over whose ego will lead the next siege. It's war as stalemate, grueling, expensive, and oddly bureaucratic. Carthage begins hiring mercenaries in larger numbers, especially from Spain and North Africa. They bring Numidian cavalry, fast, deadly horsemen who dart in and out like hornets. Rome, for all its might, still struggles with flexibility. Their strength is in stubbornness, not improvisation. Here's a quirky tidbit. Roman soldiers unused to sea voyages are said to have become so seasick during battles that some had to fight with one hand and hold their stomachs with the other. Not exactly the image of invincible legionnaires, but nobody looks noble mid-vomit. After years of back-and-forth bloodshed, Rome pushes into North Africa itself, trying to strike at Carthage directly. They land troops under Marcus Atilius Regulus, and for a hot second it looks like victory is in reach. Carthage is caught off guard. Regulus wins early skirmishes and demands humiliating terms. But then comes a Carthaginian counterattack, led by Spartan mercenary Xanthippus, yes, an actual Spartan, which seems unfair. He reorganizes the Carthaginian forces, unleashes war elephants like living battering rams, and crushes the Roman invaders. Regulus is captured, possibly tortured, possibly sent back to Rome to argue for peace, depending on which source you trust. Historians still argue whether Regulus returned voluntarily, knowing he'd be executed, or whether later Romans just invented that detail to make themselves feel heroic. Back in Sicily, the war continues in fits and starts. Siege warfare becomes the new normal. Cities like Lilybaeum and Drepana are turned into fortified meat grinders. The Carthaginians score a major naval win at Drepana in 249 BCE, thanks in part to Roman overconfidence and a little bit of sheer incompetence. Consul Publius Claudius Pulcher famously throws sacred chickens overboard when they refuse to eat before battle, a bad omen. He says if they won't eat, let them drink, and proceeds to lose the battle spectacularly. Never mess with chickens, especially divine ones. Still, Rome learns. Slowly, painfully. The Senate stops using the corvus, realizing it makes ships too top-heavy in storms. They focus on building better ships, training better crews, and choosing their battles more wisely. Carthage, meanwhile, starts to run low on funds. Their mercenary heavy model is expensive, and their hold on Sicily is slipping. Here's where the long game comes into view. Rome's not playing to win quickly, they're playing to outlast. Eventually, in 241 BCE, a final Roman naval victory off the Aegates Islands forces Carthage to sue for peace. Their treasury is empty, their navy broken, and their will to fight drained. The Treaty of Lutatius ends the war. Carthage gives up Sicily, pays a crushing indemnity, and limps away. But the peace isn't peace, it's pause. Rome annexes Sicily, then snatches Sardinia and Corsica under shady circumstances, provoking deep resentment. Carthage, humiliated, turns its eyes west to Spain, where a man named Hamilcar Barca begins rebuilding the family honor. So you leave this war not with closure, but with a gnawing sense of unfinished business. Carthage hasn't forgotten. And in a little boy's heart, Hamilcar's son, an oath is already taking root. One that says Rome will pay for this. You sit now on the edge of a battered Carthaginian pier, feet dangling just above water, still slick with tar and salt from years of shipbuilding. The war has ended, at least officially, but the Mediterranean is not calm. It's never truly calm. The peace between Rome and Carthage is brittle like a clay pot, still hot from the kiln, and one careless tap might shatter everything again. The First Punic War left scars on both sides, but for Carthage the wounds go deeper. Their treasury is gutted, their fleet crippled, and their reputation bruised in front of all their neighbors and trade partners. Worse still, Carthage now has to deal with its own mercenaries, soldiers, who fought in Sicily, who bled for the city, and who now want to be paid. Spoiler: Carthage can't pay them. This leads directly to what might be history's most awkward and dangerous bonus negotiation, the mercenary war. Thousands of hardened veterans, mostly from North Africa and Spain, rise up against Carthage itself when their gold fails to arrive. They seize towns, blockade cities, and begin to demand concessions like union reps with very large spears. This is where you see the emergence of a man you'll need to keep your eye on: Hamilcar Barca. He's the Carthaginian general who'd fought in the First Punic War and whose burning desire for revenge had survived the defeat. While others are bickering in the Carthaginian Senate or fleeing from angry, unpaid mercenaries, Hamilcar leads troops with cold precision and frightening charisma. He crushes the rebellion efficiently, brutally. He doesn't just restore order, he carves out a new direction. And now here's your mainstream historical fact to recover from the indemnity and humiliation. Carthage sets its sights on Iberia, modern-day Spain, a land rich in silver manpower and strategic value. Hamilcar leads this expedition himself along with his young son Hannibal and begins building what's effectively a new Carthaginian empire in exile. Some historians even call it New Carthage in spirit, if not in name. You trek alongside their army through rugged Spanish hills and hot red plains where the wind tastes of copper and sun-baked dust. The locals resist, of course, but Hamilcar, strategist that he is, defeats them by a mix of force and diplomacy. Cities are taken, alliances struck, silver mines claimed. Carthage now controls more land in Iberia than they ever did in Sicily. Rome watches this with an increasing itch behind the ears. Officially there's peace, but peace doesn't stop them from squinting across the Mediterranean with suspicion. Now here's your quirky tidbit. Carthaginian soldiers in Iberia allegedly trained war elephants by giving them wine. Not to befriend them, no, to get them angry. The theory was that a tipsy elephant was harder to control, sure, but infinitely more terrifying in battle. Just imagine being trampled by a creature that's both enormous and extremely belligerent after a few goblets of red. Meanwhile, Hamilcar trains his sons, not just in tactics and riding, but in ideology. And Hannibal, his oldest boy, is said to have sworn a blood oath at the age of 9, standing before his father and the gods, promising eternal hatred toward Rome. Historians still argue whether this oath was a literal ritual or a story invented later by Roman authors to give their great enemy an appropriately dramatic origin. Either way, it sticks. Rome, meanwhile, does what Rome does best: expands. They tighten their grip on Sardinia, and Corsica consolidates Sicily and begin meddling in northern Italy's tribal affairs. They build roads, always roads, and send colonists to the far reaches of the peninsula. But they never forget Carthage. Every trade ship that sails from Spain with silver, stamped in Punic script, is a reminder that their rival still breathes, and breathes deeply. In 228 BCE, Hamilcar dies, some say in battle, others by drowning. Leadership passes to his son-in-law Hasdrubal the Fair, who founds a glittering new capital, Court Hadasht New City, which the Romans will one day call Carthago Nova. Under Hasdrubal, Carthaginian diplomacy smooths out. Treaties are signed, including one with Rome that sets the Ebro River as the northern limit of Carthaginian expansion. It's meant to prevent another war. It will, of course, do the opposite. Because just south of the Ebro lies a small independent city-state called Saguntum, and Rome has, for reasons still hotly debated, taken a keen interest in it. It's not technically theirs, it's not technically Carthage's either, but it's the kind of place where lines blur and then bleed. In 221 BCE, Hasdrubal is assassinated, possibly by a disgruntled Iberian, and now finally command passes to Hannibal. The boy with the blood oath has become a man, a general, and not just any general. You see it in the way he moves through the ranks, quiet but decisive, always aware of the terrain, always looking toward the horizon. His soldiers adore him. His enemies underestimate him. His plan: bait Rome into war. Not through open aggression, but through a trap baited with pride. And so in 219 BCE, Hannibal attacks Saguntum. It's a deliberate provocation, an apple tossed at the feet of Rome like a dare. The city is besieged, battered, and taken. And Rome, oh, Rome does not like this one bit. They send envoys to Carthage, demanding justice. The Carthaginian Senate listens, shrugs, and replies that they do not control Hannibal's actions in Iberia, which is true but also deeply unhelpful. Rome declares war again. So here you stand at the threshold of the Second Punic War. But this time it's different. This time it's personal. Rome humiliated Carthage once. Hannibal remembers. His family remembers. And unlike last time, he's not going to wait for Rome to come to him. He's going to bring the war straight to Rome's doorstep, over mountains, through snow, with elephants. You rise with Hannibal's army before dawn, the air in Iberia still heavy with dew and the scent of burned cedar from last night's campfires. Around you, soldiers stir, Libyans tightening greaves, Iberians checking spear tips, Celts muttering in half-sleep. Somewhere off in the dark, a handler coaxes a sullen war elephant to rise with gentle thumps of a stick and words in a language older than Carthage itself. This is not a typical Carthaginian force. This is a patchwork of people's tongues, weapons, and grudges, all held together by the will of a single man with murder in his memory. Hannibal isn't just preparing for war, he's planning a masterpiece. He knows that to defeat Rome, you don't wait behind walls or ships. You strike at the heart. You break their rhythm. You make Rome play your game. And so begins one of the most audacious military campaigns in human history. Hannibal will not sail to Italy. He will walk there with 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and nearly 40 elephants. Oh, and he'll go through the Alps in winter. Now here's your mainstream historical fact. In 218 BCE, Hannibal begins his legendary crossing of the Alps, a feat that shocks even the Romans. No one had thought it possible. The Alps aren't just mountains, they're natural walls carved by cruel geology. Snow blinds you, rock slides haunt your every step. Paths vanish beneath your feet, and worse still, there are Gaulish tribes waiting with ambushes like thorny welcomes. And yet Hannibal presses forward. You trudge beside the column as it winds into the high passes, the cold biting into your fingers, even under layers of wool. The elephants, though majestic, struggle. One slips and nearly crushes a dozen men. Another, terrified by the echo of an avalanche, trumpets wildly and bolts into a ravine. Morale frays. Men die by the hundreds. Exhaustion, frostbite, falling rocks. And yet forward, always forward. Historians still argue over which precise pass Hannibal used, the Little St. Bernard, the Col de Clapier. No ancient source agrees entirely, and modern scholars bicker like siblings over a family map. What's clear, though, is that Hannibal did it. He crossed the Alps, fewer than half his men survived, and most of the elephants died en route. But when he descended into the Po Valley of northern Italy, he wasn't just a foreign general, he was a ghost from Carthage returned to collect a debt. You arrive in the rich flatlands of Cisalpine Gaul, where Roman allies farm in peace, blissfully unaware that a vengeful storm now marches among their vineyards. Hannibal wastes no time. He starts recruiting local Gallic tribes who hate Roman rule. His army, though battered, regrows like a hydra. And then he strikes hard, fast, and unexpected. At the river Trebia, he ambushes a Roman force during breakfast. Literally, he lets them cross a freezing river, half-dressed and hungry, before his cavalry hits their flanks like a thunderclap. It's a massacre. The survivors flee in a panic. Then comes Lake Trasimene. Hannibal hides his entire army in morning fog beside a lake path. The Roman column marches right into the trap. In the confusion, thousands die or drown, and the consul Flaminius is speared off his horse like a boar in the woods. Here's your quirky tidbit. After Trasimene, Romans began consulting the Sibylline books, ancient prophetic texts, out of sheer panic. They even buried people alive in the forum as a sacrifice to appease the gods. Rome wasn't just afraid, it was supernaturally afraid. And yet Rome doesn't break. That's the maddening part. Any other city would surrender, not Rome. They adapt. They appoint a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus, who adopts a new strategy: don't fight. He shadows Hannibal, cuts off supplies, and avoids open battle at all costs. It's cautious, it's frustrating, but it works, sort of. Hannibal can't catch him, but Fabius can't beat him either. Rome's people naturally get impatient. They mock Fabius as the delea cunctator, and pressure builds for decisive victory. So the next year, Rome raises its largest army ever, 80,000 strong, and marches out under two consuls who believe bravery can substitute for caution. You can already hear the tragic music rising, because Hannibal's next move will carve his name into history so deep that even those who hate him will whisper it with awe. He chooses the battlefield, he controls the wind, he reshapes the very ground. And when those legions reach Cannae, they're walking straight into a lion's jaw. But back here in the cold dawn of Hannibal's revenge, you watch as a boy from Iberia, raised on his father's bitterness and Spain's hard soil, turns the tables on a republic that once laughed at Carthage's defeat. He's crossed the Alps, he's marched across Italy, and he hasn't even hit his crescendo yet. There is no turning back now. You wake at Cannae to the stillness that always comes before something permanent breaks. The air is thick and dry, no birdsong, just the dull thud of Roman sandals in the distance and the occasional clink of armor as troops fidget in formation. This is not just a battle, this is a statement. Hannibal has baited Rome here like a master tactician laying a trap with the patience of a spider, and now 80,000 Roman soldiers are marching right into it. You glance around. The Carthaginian camp seems oddly quiet. No chaos, no shouting, just calm preparation. Numidian cavalry polish curved swords, Iberian infantry check the buckles of their short tunics, and Hannibal. He stands by a ridge, his eyes scanning the wide, flat plain like a sculptor appraising marble. He's not here to fight fair. He's here to end an illusion, the illusion that Rome cannot be broken. Mainstream historical fact incoming. The Battle of Cannae, fought in 216 BCE, is one of the most studied military engagements of all time. Not because of its scale alone, but because of its geometry. Hannibal doesn't just win, he outthinks an army twice his size. He arranges his troops in a convex curve, lightly armed Gauls and Spaniards in the center, heavy African infantry on the flanks, cavalry on the wings. When the Romans charge forward, as they always do, they push into the center like a battering ram, only to find the soft part of Hannibal's line slowly giving way, not breaking, but bending. Then it happens. As the Romans plunge deeper into what they think is a retreat, the African infantry on either side wraps around like jaws closing. The cavalry, having routed their Roman counterparts, circles back and slams into the rear. The result, Rome's greatest army is completely surrounded, encircled in what military nerds today call a double envelopment. And here's the part that hits you hardest, it works too well. Inside that shrinking ring of spears and shields, it becomes less of a battle and more of a butcher's pen. The Roman soldiers are so tightly packed, they can't raise their weapons. They're crushed by their own numbers, trampled, suffocated, stabbed without room to fall. By the end of the day, over 50,000 Romans lie dead or dying. Entire legions vanish from the map. Here's your quirky tidbit. Hannibal's victory was so total that after the battle his men collected gold rings from dead Roman nobles, so many in fact that they allegedly filled a bushel basket and sent it to Carthage as proof. A bushel of finger jewelry. Ancient warfare had some very macabre inventory reports. Rome reels. The city enters full panic. Doors are barricaded, public mourning declared. There's talk, serious talk of recalling the exiled dictator Fabius Maximus and even surrendering outright. But then Rome does what Rome always does. It decides not to die. It bans the word peace in the Senate. It enlists slaves, debtors, and teenagers to refill its armies. They melt down temple offerings to fund new legions, and somehow they endure. Historians still argue whether Hannibal made his greatest mistake after Cannae by not marching on Rome itself. Some sources say his cavalry was too depleted, his supply lines too long. Others suggest he hesitated, hoping Rome would come to the table. His general Hannibal allegedly snapped at him, "You know how to win battles, but not how to use them." Harsh, maybe unfair, but it lingers. You stay with Hannibal as he roams Italy like a ghost with a grudge. He moves up and down the peninsula for more than a decade, winning skirmishes, recruiting allies, threatening cities. But it becomes clear, slowly, frustratingly, that Rome has learned. They no longer give him open battles. Instead, they wear him down. They block supply routes. They chip away at his support. Cities that promise to join him hesitate. Others are punished by Rome for trying. Still, Carthage sends reinforcements slowly, hesitantly. The Senate back home is divided. Some want to back Hannibal with everything. Others fear he's become too independent, too famous. Even his own brother Hasdrubal tries to reach him with a second army from Spain, but is intercepted and killed. His severed head is thrown into Hannibal's camp. Message received. And yet Hannibal persists. You walk with him into southern Italy, where he holds out in friendly towns and fields smaller armies with bigger reputations. Rome sends more generals. He defeats some, escapes others, always one step ahead like a man dancing with a bear on a cliff edge. Here's one more peculiar gem. In some towns, Hannibal issued coins bearing his own name, an unusual move for a Carthaginian, as it wasn't traditional. But it signals something. He's not just a general, he's becoming a symbol, a rival republic unto himself. But symbols can't march forever. By now you see it in his eyes. The war is dragging. The Italian allies are losing faith. Rome is relentless. No matter how many times Hannibal wins, he cannot destroy it. He cannot make it quit. And with each year, the dream of a total Carthaginian victory starts to fade like breath on a mirror receding into cold. Still you camp with the army each night, hearing old veterans whisper of Cannae like it was yesterday. That perfect, terrifying day when Rome nearly ended. But nearly isn't the same as done, and Rome isn't done. You find yourself drifting westward now, away from the smoking ruins of Cannae and the weary camps of Hannibal's ever-thinning army, toward the quiet hum of a different theatre Spain. While Italy groans under Hannibal's long shadow, Rome opens a new front. It's a gamble, yes, but one that smells suspiciously like strategy. Instead of chasing Hannibal in circles, Rome begins peeling away his support, one province at a time, starting with his own backyard. In Spain, the campaign is handed to a young Roman named Publius Cornelius Scipio, son of a general, killed in the Iberian front, which you might call awkward inheritance. He's untested, ambitious, and a little too composed for someone barely old enough to rent a chariot. And yet you can tell something's different about him. He watches, he listens, and then he moves like thunder. Mainstream historical fact here. In 209 BC, Scipio leads a daring and unexpected assault on Carthage, New Carthage, the jewel of Carthage's Spanish territories. It's bold, dangerous, and timed perfectly with the tides. He attacks while the city garrison is out of position, exploiting an unguarded lagoon at low tide to enter from the rear. The city falls. Just like that, Carthage loses its greatest port in Spain and a massive chunk of its silver weapon stockpiles and morale. You walk through the city in the aftermath, dodging toppled amphorae and shattered shields. It's not just a military victory, it's a psychological one. The Roman soldiers chant Scipio's name, and so begins his transformation into Scipio Africanus, the man who will one day face Hannibal as an equal. But the war doesn't end overnight. Carthage fights back with everything it has left in Iberia, including Hannibal's younger brother Mago and his more competent one, Hasdrubal, yes, another Hasdrubal. It was apparently the Punic version of Kevin. You follow Scipio through a whirlwind of battles, alliances, and clever diplomacy. He doesn't just conquer, he converts. He makes allies out of enemies and lets Iberian chieftains keep their crowns if they change sides. It's less Roman arrogance, more Roman chess. Meanwhile, back in Italy, Hannibal waits. He's still undefeated in open battle, still feared, but now dangerously isolated. His pleas for reinforcements are met with silence, or worse, vague promises from Carthage's cautious Senate. So he waits in the south, and when he hears that his brother Hasdrubal is bringing a new army from Spain to join him, he finally dares to hope. But Rome too hears about Hasdrubal's march. They intercept him near the Metaurus River. It's brutal. The Romans slaughter Hasdrubal's forces, and in one of those moments history writes in blood, they decapitate him and throw his head into Hannibal's camp. You're there when it lands, with a dull thud in the dirt dust curling around it like a veil. It is without doubt the worst family reunion in history. Quirky tidbit: the Romans supposedly used a code of painted shields to signal Hasdrubal's movements to other units. Think of it as ancient semaphore, but with more spears and fewer flags. It worked. It worked a little too well. Now comes Scipio's final move. After securing Spain, he turns his gaze not on Hannibal, but on Carthage itself. He proposes a radical idea to the Senate: let him take the war to Africa. Force Carthage to recall Hannibal. Strike them where they're most vulnerable. It's risky, controversial, and frankly, a little rude. But Rome agrees. Scipio sails to North Africa with a lean, disciplined army and begins courting Numidian tribes, specifically Massinissa, a brilliant cavalry commander with grudges to spare. The Numidians once fought for Carthage. Now they switch sides, bringing elite horsemen who can run circles around anything on two legs. Carthage, stunned and scrambling, calls Hannibal home. You ride with him as he boards ship, leaving behind 15 years of Italian soil victories that meant everything but changed nothing, and an army that will never march again. He is not the same man who crossed the Alps. He's older, thinner, quieter. There's steel in his eyes, yes, but also dust, like a sword that's been too long out of its sheath. Historians still argue whether Hannibal wanted to return. Some say he was eager for a final confrontation. Others say he knew the game was lost, but pride left him no choice. Maybe both are true. Pride and obligation often travel together in the same chariot. You now walk the sands near Zama, an unassuming plain in North Africa, just southwest of Carthage. It's 202 BCE, the final act begins. Scipio and Hannibal meet face to face before the battle. Not in combat, but in a diplomatic parley. No armor, no trumpets. Just two of the greatest military minds in history talking across a tent. They try to negotiate peace. It fails. Too much blood. Too many graves. And so the next morning they line up for battle. It's a different stage now. No alpine cliffs, no foggy lakes, just clear skies and desert wind. Hannibal's army is a shadow of its former self, newly levied infantry, a few veteran units, and 80 war elephants at the front. Scipio has well-trained legions and Numidian cavalry under Massinissa eager for payback. The elephants charge. Scipio's men step aside, forming lanes for them to pass harmlessly through. Some panic. Others turn back and trample their own lines. The Roman counterattack begins. And you feel it then, the weight of two worlds colliding. The genius of Hannibal meets the discipline of Scipio. And this time, Rome has the edge. Slowly, relentlessly, Carthaginian lines falter. Massinissa's cavalry flanks from the rear. Hannibal's troops are surrounded. For the first time in decades, he retreats not from fear, but from necessity. The wind across Zama dies slowly, carrying with it the sounds of the final spears clattering to the earth, the last hoofbeats retreating into dust, and the silence that always follows a world unmade. You're still on the field? As the bodies cool, Roman, Carthaginian, Numidian side by side in the same anonymous stillness. What began decades ago with a Sicilian town and a handful of mercenaries has ended here in the parched African dust beneath a sky that offers no consolation. Hannibal survives barely. He withdraws to Carthage, exhausted, quiet, and cloaked in a strange stillness. He isn't paraded through Rome in chains. He isn't dragged behind a triumphal chariot. He simply walks away because Scipio, ever the politician as much as soldier, refuses to humiliate the man who nearly brought Rome to its knees. Instead, they meet once more in Carthage, two legends shaking hands in the ashes of ambition. Mainstream historical fact: the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE marks the end of the Second Punic War. Rome dictates peace, and Carthage has no choice but to accept. The terms are harsh. Carthage must pay another immense indemnity, surrender most of its fleet, and agree never to declare war without Rome's permission. It is essentially a peace treaty with handcuffs. And yet Carthage doesn't disappear, not yet. It becomes a client state, surviving on trade and quiet resentment. Hannibal astonishingly stays on as a statesman. He reforms taxes, reduces corruption, and strengthens Carthage's finances more effectively than most of its past leaders ever did with armies. But he is always watched, always suspected. Rome cannot forgive a memory as dangerous as his. Historians still debate how long Hannibal could have lasted had he stayed still, but he doesn't. A few years after Zama, with Roman pressure building, he flees into voluntary exile. You follow him across the eastern Mediterranean, from the court of Antiochus III in Syria to lesser-known corners of Asia Minor, always advising, always outmaneuvering, always hunted. Rome wants him gone, but his mind is too sharp to fade quietly. Eventually cornered and facing capture, He chooses poison over chains. His last alleged words are a bitter joke. Let us relieve the Romans of their fears by the death of a feeble old man. Back in Rome, Scipio Africanus fares no better. Despite his service, his victories, and his careful balancing act between military glory and Senate diplomacy, his popularity wanes. Rivals accuse him of corruption. Politics turns cold. He retires in bitterness, allegedly asking that his tomb bear the inscription, Ingrata patria ne ossa quidem habebis, ungrateful fatherland, you will not even have my bones. For two men who shaped the fate of the world, history can be unkind. And here's your quirky tidbit: after Zama, Roman schoolboys began studying the war, not just for history but for rhetoric. They were taught to argue pro and con about Hannibal's choices. Was crossing the Alps genius or madness? Was avoiding Rome after Cannae a missed opportunity, or strategic patience? Imagine your entire life becoming a classroom debate. But if you listen closely, the story doesn't end there. Not quite. Because in the years following, Zama, Rome keeps growing. It absorbs Greece. It eyes the eastern kingdoms. And across the Mediterranean, Carthage remains, existing, trading, rebuilding. But always under the thumb of Roman permission. That permission begins to chafe. In Carthage, the younger generation chafes at Rome's leash. Merchants grumble. Former soldiers tell stories of Hannibal's campaigns like bedtime tales twisted with fury. Meanwhile in Rome, a new chorus of suspicion rises. Senator Cato the Elder begins ending every speech regardless of topic, with the phrase Carthago, delenda est Carthage, must be destroyed. Even if the Senate's debating road construction or grain prices, Cato inserts the line like a nagging itch. Why? Because Carthage, though militarily neutered, is thriving economically. It's profitable again. And in Roman minds, wealth and independence are merely the dress rehearsal for defiance. Eventually, Carthage breaks the treaty technically by defending itself against an invasion from the neighboring Numidians. Rome seizes the excuse. A new war is declared. This is no conquest. This is an execution. You return to Carthage in 149 BCE and walk among people who know what's coming. Still they prepare. They melt gold and bronze for weapons. They free slaves to bolster numbers. They reinforce walls. The siege lasts 3 years. Starvation creeps in. Mothers hush children in the dark as battering rams echo from beyond the gates. When Rome finally breaks through, it does not spare. The general Scipio Aemilianus, grandson by adoption to Scipio Africanus, leads the assault. He respects Carthage's courage. He also burns it to the ground. House by house, street by street. Survivors are sold into slavery. Some say salt is sown into the fields, so nothing can grow. That part, likely myth. But symbolically, it sticks. Here's one final oddity. After Carthage fell, Scipio Aemilianus is said to have wept. When asked why, he quoted Homer, speaking of Troy's fall, and whispered that he feared the same would one day happen to Rome. A rare moment when even the victors see the price of their triumph. You stand now on the rubble of a city that once ruled the waves, bartered in purple dye, marched elephants through snow, and nearly broke an empire. It is gone, yes, but not forgotten. Rome may have destroyed Carthage, but in doing so it bound their names together, forever rival, and shadow, ghost, and echo. And so the dust settles. You drift now through silence, through streets that no longer exist, past harbour stones that once saw ships from every coast, past altars and markets and balconies that whispered in 3 languages. Carthage is gone, yes, but in the space it once filled, Rome now finds something unexpected: a mirror. For in destroying their greatest rival, the Romans also destroy the last limit to their ambition. What rises in Carthage's place is not just ash, it's empire. The Third Punic War is over, but its shadow stretches across the Senate chambers, across the grain fields of Sicily, and across the red-tinted marble of Rome's growing monuments. There is no longer a Mediterranean with Rome and Carthage. Now there is only Rome and the sea mare nostrum, our sea, as they begin to call it. The phrase rolls off Roman tongues like a birthright, but you remember, when that sea was shared, when Carthaginian sails once sliced these waves too. Now Carthage is a Roman province, later in a flourish of imperial branding Julius Caesar, and then Augustus rebuilt it as Colonia Julia Carthago, a Roman colony for veterans and settlers. The new city flourishes, it becomes grand, busy, productive, one of the jewels of Roman Africa. But the soul of old Carthage, the Punic spirit that lives elsewhere, thin and scattered perhaps in the Berber hills, perhaps in family stories, whispered behind closed doors, or perhaps only in the memories of those who still study the long war that once split the sea in two. Here's your mainstream historical fact: by the time of the empire, Carthage is again among the largest cities in Africa, second only to Alexandria. It boasts amphitheaters, aqueducts, temples to Jupiter, where once stood temples to Baal. Rome builds over what it burned, but like planting trees in a graveyard, the past never quite stays buried. But there's an irony, isn't there? The more Rome becomes the unchallenged power, the more it begins to resemble what it once despised. Carthage had once been a trade empire ruling not through land but wealth, not through soldiers but shipping contracts. Now, Rome is doing the same. Taxes roll in from Syria, spices from India, tribute from the Danube, and armies are kept not just for conquest but for control. You begin to see it slowly, uncomfortably, that the republic that once feared Carthaginian corruption is becoming imperial. Historians still argue whether the destruction of Carthage was an act of necessity or paranoia. Was Rome acting on defensive instinct, an ancient superpower stamping out the last flicker of danger, or was it simply an excuse to remove the only player left on the board who might say no? Even Roman sources waffle. Polybius, who lived through the war, writes of it with solemn dread. Later authors frame it with pride, and modern scholars, well, you'd need a longer script. Back in Rome, Senator Cato the Elder gets his wish, though he doesn't live to see it. But his ghost lingers in the phrase Carthago delenda est, echoing long after the last stone falls. It becomes a case study, a slogan, a warning, a reminder that some fears, if repeated enough, can burn cities. You walk now with veterans of the Punic Wars, some blind with age, others dragging limbs given up to battlefields long since swallowed by grain. They tell stories to children, some accurate, some embellished. They remember Hannibal with both hatred and awe. In fact, Hannibal becomes something like a myth, the general who outwitted Rome, who crossed mountains, who made Romans tremble in their own forum. Mothers even use his name to scare unruly children. Hannibal is at the gates, they say, even when he's been dead for decades. And here's your quirky tidbit: Augustus, Rome's first emperor, once visited Hannibal's old battlefield in Spain, and wept not because of the loss, but because of the greatness of the opponent. Rome, ever performative, still knew how to admire the people it crushed. They made busts of Hannibal, they wrote biographies, they placed him in debates in schools and painted his name across marble halls. Nothing like the Romans for turning enemies into curriculum. Yet you also see what was lost. Carthaginian science, navigation, language all slowly disappear. Punic, the native language, fades until only fragments survive on inscriptions and tombs. Religion changes, trade shifts, identity thins. The Carthaginian worldview, so rooted in the sea, in trade networks, in ancient Phoenician rites, is diluted in the basin of Rome's cultural monopoly. But fragments survive: a few coins, a child's amulet, a broken mask used in temple plays. You find one buried in the dust near the ruins of a house wall, its paint long faded. Someone long ago once played a part in a Carthaginian tale you'll never fully recover. But that's the thing about history, it never disappears, it just waits to be reassembled. So now you walk among ghosts, not just of Carthage, but of Rome too, because Rome will fall. Not today, not for centuries, but the same empire that could destroy Carthage will one day find itself split, invaded, and remembered mostly through its ruins. The empire that feared foreign merchants will become one that cannot function without them. The republic that crushed Carthage to preserve freedom will one day hand itself to emperors in togas backed by legions and divine titles. This story of Rome and Carthage doesn't end in fire. It ends in echoes. You drift now to a world that feels quieter, but only on the surface. Beneath its polished marble and measured Senate orations, Rome pulses with the consequences of having won too much. Carthage is ash, yes, but Rome finds itself strangely restless. You'd think victory would bring peace. Instead, it brings appetite. Expansion becomes tradition. Conquest becomes administration. The Republic becomes tangled in its own success, and somewhere beneath the forum columns, you sense it, the creeping rot of overreach. It starts slowly. Rome reorganizes Carthage's old holdings into provinces Africa, Hispania, Numidia, managed by governors who promise to serve the Republic, but often serve themselves. Corruption blooms in the cracks of distance. Trade flows, but so do grievances. Meanwhile, veterans returning from Punic wars expect land only to find it bought up by the wealthy elites who now use slaves from those same wars to till massive estates. Displacement follows. So does unrest. Mainstream historical fact: the aftershocks of the Punic Wars directly contribute to the rise of populist politics in Rome. Reformers like the Gracchi brothers try to redistribute land to veterans, and the poor, invoking memories of past wars and past promises. Their violent ends mark the beginning of Rome's slow unraveling. The Republic, once built on unity and civic duty, now simmers with factionalism, street violence and civil war. And yet somewhere under that Carthage still lingers. Not in stone, not in armies, but in legacy. Hannibal remains in Roman imagination like a ghost they both fear and admire. His tactics are studied at military academies. His name still sends shivers through old generals. Even centuries later, Roman authors refer to him not with hatred, but fascination. They call him ingeniosus vir, a man of genius. Imagine living long enough to become your enemy's favorite cautionary tale. Historians still argue whether Rome's post-Carthage expansion was inevitable or reactive. Did the fall of its greatest rival unleash its imperial nature, or was it always bound to happen and Carthage just happened to be the first domino? You walk the marble halls where those debates begin. You hear echoes in Senate debates where the name Hannibal is invoked not to scare, but to warn: never again let an enemy grow unchecked. But of course, history doesn't obey warnings. In North Africa, despite Roman efforts to erase it, something new stirs in the ashes. Punic culture isn't entirely gone. It survives in subtle ways in rural temples, repurposed for Roman gods, in olive groves, planted by Punic hands, in folk customs that blend Phoenician roots with new Latin rhythms. By the early centuries of the Common Era, North Africa is one of Rome's most vibrant regions. Augustine of Hippo, the Christian theologian who'll help define Western thought, is born there. His hometown, Tagaste, not far from ancient Carthage. Here's your quirky tidbit: even centuries after its destruction, Carthage's ghost is so present that when the Vandals arrive in the 5th century, yes, the Vandals, the ones who give us the word for senseless destruction, they choose Carthage as their capital. Not Rome, not Alexandria, Carthage. There's something about that harbor, that geography, that symbolism. Even ruin holds power. You now walk through the Roman Carthage of late antiquity. It's no longer a memory, it's a real bustling city again: forums, theatres, bathhouses. The past, buried under layers of new stone, still hums beneath your feet. And then slowly even this fades. As Rome crumbles and Byzantines rise, and later, as Arab armies sweep through North Africa, Carthage vanishes again. Not in fire this time, but in time. Covered by centuries, stolen by erosion, reshaped by new tongues and stories. But every once in a while a spade strikes something old. A Punic inscription, a coin bearing a ship and crescent moon. A child's toy made of clay, shaped like a lion. You kneel beside it, brush away the soil, and for a flicker of a moment, the world of Carthage breathes again. Today you can stand where it once stood. A suburb of Tunis now covers the ruins, but dig deep enough, literally or in your imagination, and you'll find them: the circular harbours of the old navy, the walls that held Rome at bay, the stones that heard the last cries of a fading city. Tourists come, snap photos, move on. But if you listen closely, the wind still carries two voices, Rome's proud and ironclad, and Carthage's soft but unbroken. Because here's the truth, destruction isn't the end. Memory is slippery, yes, and winners write histories. But every time you hear the phrase Carthage must be destroyed, remember that it had to be said so often because Carthage refused to vanish quietly. You sit now on the threshold between myth and memory. The fires of Carthage have cooled. The Roman legions have marched on to new conquests. The Mediterranean, once bristling with conflict, lies, still its waves licking shores now ruled by emperors and administrators instead of generals. But as you lean back into the final stretch of this long and winding tale, you realize this wasn't just a war between cities. It was a war between worldviews, between land and sea, between tradition and commerce, between caution and ambition. Rome, ever the plough and the spear, never quite understood Carthage's heart. And Carthage, skilled in navigation and negotiation, perhaps underestimated Rome's relentless will. When the two collided, it wasn't just personal, it was philosophical, a duel of identities, and both in their way were forever changed by it. You stroll through the ruins one last time, past toppled columns and broken amphorae, past courtyards where children once played under the scent of pressed olives and salted fish. Here once stood a city of merchants who worshipped Baal and counted profits in silver talents. Here marched Hannibal's soldiers, their sandals dusty from mountain snow. Here Rome burned down, not just a rival, but a reminder that empires can bleed too. Mainstream historical fact: after Carthage's final fall, Rome transitions rapidly from republic to empire. The concentration of power accelerates. The Senate becomes less a debating chamber and more a rubber stamp. Julius Caesar rises, the republic collapses, Augustus rules, the wheel turns. And yet, despite its destruction, Carthage becomes a template. Rome learns from its fallen foe. It takes Carthage's naval practices, its administrative structures, even its emphasis on trade. The very empire that sought to erase it ends up borrowing its tools. Historians still argue whether Carthage's legacy truly ended or whether it simply changed form, hiding in the very DNA of its destroyer. You trace your hand along an ancient mosaic in the rebuilt Roman Carthage, noticing the detail: a ship at sail dolphins leaping a Punic-style anchor tucked in the corner. It's a Roman flaw, yes, but the sea, that's Carthaginian. That part never really left. And here's your quirky final tidbit: in the 20th century, after millennia of ruin and silence, the modern nation of Tunisia adopted the image of Carthage as a symbol of pride. Statues of Hannibal now stand again. Children learn his name not as a Roman villain, but as a national hero. And in 1985, the mayor of Rome and the mayor of Tunis symbolically signed a peace treaty over 2,000 years late, but sincere. Sometimes history loops in gentle poetic spirals. You sit now at the end of the road, but the echoes continue. Every war waged with preemptive logic. Every city destroyed because it might rise again. Every moment when fear masquerades as necessity. Those are Carthage's ghost stories still walking. And so we wind down slowly now. The waves outside Carthage's long-lost harbor whisper faintly in the dark, no longer troubled by warships. The fires have long gone out. The stones have cooled. Rome is asleep, and Carthage dreams. Now let your shoulders relax. Feel the slow, deep pull of sleep creeping in from the corners of your mind. You've walked far tonight, through centuries of fire, snow salt, and silence, through betrayal and strategy, courage and collapse. You've stood beside ancient soldiers, heard Senate speeches echoed in marble halls, and watched history bloom and wither in the same breath. Let the noise of battle fade behind you now. The horns are quiet, the shields are stacked. The elephants, once thundering through the Alps, sleep beside rivers that no longer remember their names. Even Hannibal, whose eyes once burned with vengeance, has stepped off the stage, leaving only soft footprints in the dust of memory. And overhead, the sky is still the same stars that watched over Zama, over Sicily, over Carthage's last embers. They shine faintly now, blinking through the haze of centuries, still watching, still waiting. There's peace now, if only, in the quiet of this moment. So breathe, deep, unhurried. Let the tide of history recede gently, like the sea returning to rest against forgotten shores. You've heard the story. You've carried its weight. You can set it down now. Sleep well, traveler of the past. Tomorrow brings new tales, but tonight, you are safe. Carthage is silent, and Rome is dreaming.